Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 186, Reimagining Jewish Education. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're formally kicking off our series Thinking in New Ways about Jewish Education. Our first guest is Miriam Heller-Stern. She is the National Director of the School of Education and Associate Professor at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, based at the Ria Hirsch School of Education at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, Los Angeles campus. Her current research and writing interests focus on designing Jewish education as a tool for building a creative society. She collaborates frequently with teaching artists to enrich the educational effectiveness of their work and her own. Previously, she served as Dean of the Graduate Center for Jewish Education at American Jewish University, where she created Dream Lab, a strategic initiative to deepen the educational impact of teaching artists and weave a network of Jewish creatives who have a passion for education. Miriam Heller-Stern earned her PhD in Social Sciences, Policy, and Educational Practice, and her MA in History at Stanford University. We're excited to kick off this series with this conversation to look at some of the theories of education and some of the philosophies that might animate our practice of Jewish education. So, Miriam Heller-Stern, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
I'm thrilled to be here.
So let's get started with a broad question. What is education as you see it? I think a lot of people have a sense, I know what education is. And then I think once we start even talking about it for a minute, people realize, wait a second, I don't think I even know what the word education means. So could you help us understand what we're talking about?
Well, I like to think of education as the process of growth and transformation. Education is also the process by which societies create culture, pass on information, and also create new ways of being in the world. So education is really a process.
It feels like education in the Jewish world, or at least in the American Jewish world, has had a narrower definition. And I'm not sure exactly if I could define it. I'd love to get your sense of definitions throughout history, but it feels like the American Jewish community or American Jewish institutions have often thought about education as some version of just conveying of information.
One way of telling the story is to say, in the beginning, there was knowledge, and knowledge was sacred. And that sacred knowledge was passed down from generation to generation as a precious package, not to be changed. Now, living in the modern world, in the postmodern world, education itself has changed. The purpose of Jewish education has changed. We live in a world where Jews are trying to reinvent Judaism for themselves. They're integrated into the world. They want to be active in the world. And Jewish education needs to be a tool to enable them to do that successfully. So it means that the model of how we think about Jewish education has to change from that earlier model of simply passing on a tradition from one generation to the next.
So can we talk about education in different times in Jewish history? Like, I guess, we have perhaps mythic notions that there were times in Jewish history where there wasn't so much change happening, and maybe that's not accurate. I have a sense that when you live in a time, you talked about that how we live in a new kind of Jewish time today. I have a sense that when you live in a time that's more stable, I often start talks with a New Yorker cartoon where a caveman is speaking to his son or grandson, and he says, when I was your age, things were exactly the way they are now. And that in a time like that, education is quite simple and straightforward, where you just kind of make sure that the young generation has basically the same information and the same skills that the older generation had. Whereas in a time of much change and transition, that wouldn't be very useful. And then the question becomes, what is useful? But can we talk about the origins of American Jewish education, which I imagine to some extent have to do with what was Jewish education like in Europe before people came to America, And was that in some way influential on how American Jews thought about what education looked like? Or was it from the beginning a need to invent something new because America was fundamentally a new kind of Jewish existence?
If you think about the early 20th century, between 1880 and 1924, something like 40 million immigrants arrive in the United States. Approximately 2 million of them are Jews. They're trying to find their way and trying to figure out how to maintain their Jewishness in America. And that sparks what we now look back upon as a period of being in survival mode. Of course, the term survivor takes on a very different resonance during the Holocaust, but in this earlier era of chasing opportunity, trying to achieve the American dream, the survival of Judaism was about preserving Jewish life and some kind of Judaism in this very modern world of America. There was tremendous fear that the Jewish community would disappear in America. And European rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, looked upon this American landscape and saw it as the Treifa Medina, a land that was just not kosher, not fit for Judaism to stay alive and to succeed. And so we created this preservationist model. In the early 20th century, the zeitgeist of American public school education was going in really two directions, both of which, ironically, were named progressive. There was a kind of progressive education that believed in efficiency, a type of public school education where everyone has similar opportunities, then everyone has the same ladder of success. These factories should be administered efficiently, and everyone will come out ready to serve in the workforce. That was one vision of progressivism. The other vision of progressivism was one that was child-centric, that focused on growing a whole child in an educational environment. The children should play, they should have recess, they should become youth, they should have lives of leisure when they want to. They should be pulled out of factories. They should become individuals. They should learn to embrace the autonomy that American life could provide them. They should be creative. They should create culture. They should be experimenting and playing at school. So you take these two trends in progressive American life, and progressive Jewish educators saw these two ideas as opportunities for creating a new American Jewish system that would embrace everything that American education supposedly had to offer. And so there was an effort in the early 20th century led by Samson Benderly and his numerous disciples known as the Benderly Boys, although we know of many wonderful women educators who were also his disciples and part of that group, who embraced both the administrative accountability of trying to create real schools that were Jewish, and at the same time embraced the culture, the drama, the experiential component of living Jewishly in an educational space, as opposed to engaging in a lot of rote memorization and just rehearsing the old ways of being Jewish. Now, that being said, in every generation, it's been hard for parents to let go of what they know of as true or real or authentic education. And they struggle with accepting a new way of thinking about education. A lot of people think that they are experts in education because they have themselves gone through an educational system. And so even while they complain that they don't like what they see for their children, the minute you change it, they struggle to accept it as authentic. How could that possibly work? That's not how I was educated. So we see that trend in every generation.
I want to latch on to the points you made about this preservationist mindset. But before we do that, I want to name, you wrote this great essay, which I gather was delivered as a speech, actually, so maybe it wasn't an essay, but however we interpret it. And there was this beautiful picture, or I guess what's the word I'm looking for? Generative picture, where it's from the 1920s, and it's a picture of this kind of scary graphic that says, "Your children, will they be yours? A challenge to every Jew," which I think is about as good of an encapsulation of fear and preservation as you could get in a picture. I mean, it's at least a picture being worth 1,000 words, probably worth many thousands of words. So I'm curious to hear from you both some of the historical context, like how was this manifesting then? Because I think so often we seem to think this is just like a post-Holocaust piece. We seem to think that, we experienced this unimaginable trauma, and since then we've had this sense that we really need to retain what we've been given by our ancestors because we're afraid of having it wiped out. But what this shows is that actually has some antecedents before the Holocaust. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
So the image that you're describing was a brochure from the 1920s produced by the Jewish Education Association, which was essentially a marketing campaign for Jewish education.
This is in the show notes on our website, by the way, for those who want to look at the image.
Wonderful. It's a brochure that was created for Jewish parents in the 1920s to convince them to send their children to Hebrew school. Now, interestingly enough, I've actually found that image in brochures that were aimed at children. And it says, "Children, take your friends to Hebrew school." And the inside of the brochures, there were I found a series of 5 or 6 of these, and each one has a quaint little story about a child who took it upon himself or herself to go to Hebrew school, and he or she loved it, but maybe going to Hebrew school was looked down upon, or not many children went. And in each one, there's a story of bringing a friend along who had no idea how wonderful it would be. And in the end, they both discovered how much they loved being Jewish, and the teachers rewarded them for their commitment. And there's this real sense of honor and nobility for choosing the right path. The heading, "Your children, will they be yours?" over an image of a well-dressed, stately mother and her 2 children standing at the foot of a mountain, a windy path, perhaps up a mythical Mount Sinai or a metaphorical Mount Sinai with tablets at the top. The walking toward the tablets is not about achieving a deep or sophisticated Jewish knowledge for that generation. It is about living in 2 worlds and accepting the basic tenets that would allow them to carry on their tradition, but also be accepted in America. This is about the internal threat of assimilation, the fear that your children will not hold on to your tradition and therefore will not be yours anymore. And in many ways, that survivalist tendency shaped the motivation and the aims of Jewish education for the better part of the next 100 years or so. In many ways, we're still seeing that today, that fear that our children will not hold on to our values. Frankly, as a parent myself, I have a 14-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 5-year-old. I think a lot about who they're going to become. Will they hold on to the values that our family holds dear? I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of my motivation for giving them a Jewish education and, frankly, being a professional in this field. That being said, survival isn't enough. And there have been numerous educators who have talked about the need for this shift in educational aims, and that the fear factor is not enough to motivate a curriculum or generate inspiring educational outcomes. By the 1980s, 1990s, the sociological trends toward suburbanization, decline in membership, we read about this in Habits of the Heart and Bowling Alone, the notion that Americans became individuals and were less interested in membership in communities. That age of individualism, what Cohen and Eisen termed the sovereign self in Jewish life, was a trend of Jews making their own decisions, choosing their own version of Judaism or their own isms. Fast forward into the 2000s, and sociologist Sarah Benora talked about this as the iPod playlist metaphor of everyone kind of picking and choosing what works for them. At the same time, in American education, there was a similar trend toward individualism. Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences gets transformed into ways of thinking about education that are about the needs of individual learners. And differentiated education, that's Carol Tomlinson's work, and others also focus on the need to cater to different individual learners. And so you have these two parallel trends: the sociology of individualism in American religious life and the trend toward teaching to the individual learner in American education. And what that produces is a mismatch in aims and aspirations and methods in American Jewish education, because we still have this aim of a collective and the desire to preserve the collective, but the Amcha, the people, are moving toward individualism, and the trends in progressive education are also about catering to individuals. We got a little off track. It's hard to have a collective community where everyone is on their own individual journey.
One thing that you said earlier that I wanted to pick up on was that you talked about the desire to educate being motivated by wanting our children to have our values. And that I very much resonate with. It is very important for me, for my children, to have a set of values. But I feel like when I reflect on Jewish education, at least as I experienced it and as I see it, it's been less focused on values and more focused on skills, knowledge, behaviors that's related to what to do in the synagogue that's not all that much related to values. And that actually is my biggest beef with Jewish education as I feel like I inherited it or I experienced it. And what I also hear from many of my peers that are my age, who are the parents of today's generation of children, is that we were being taught to do a set of things that we don't actually do in our lives. And I guess my question is, what's the interpretation of that? You know, possibility number one, the education was a failure. It didn't educate us correctly because it didn't get us to want to do those things. You know, option number two is that the education was a failure insofar as it was a failure of imagination, meaning it didn't understand that it was okay that we didn't want to go and do those things, but it didn't know how to educate us in a way that would allow us to have the values or to somehow have a meaningful Jewish life, even though we weren't going to be doing it in a synagogue. So I'm just wondering if you could walk us through that a little bit, that connection point between the hopes of what the adult outcome of this educational process is going to be, and how does that connect to the education itself. I'll just share one story that I was on an education committee for a synagogue, and everybody went around the table and said kind of what they're hoping to get out of the education. And what I said was that we have to assume, for the purposes of this conversation, that every single child is going to marry somebody who's not Jewish and is not going to come to synagogue very often. And, you know, whatever other list of things that ostensibly were not the hopes and dreams of the conservative synagogue, and that we have to say that is the life that our children are likely to occupy. And the question is, what kind of education will make them meaningfully and importantly Jewish in light of that, as opposed to somehow that we're going to, you know, be preventing something, which I think also actually was seemed to be a driving force of Jewish education when I was a child, that it was about sort of preventing something, whether that preventing was for you to marry someone who's not Jewish or preventing you from being the kind of person who doesn't come to synagogue or whatever. And that feels like that wasn't too successful. And yet when I said this idea about we should sort of develop a picture of what we think our children probably will be like, and then give them the Jewish education that's going to best best be an important part of that life. It wasn't something that the group, I mean, it wasn't that everybody in the group was against that. It was just, I think, a little shocking to them that somebody would say it.
You're describing a case of conflicting or perhaps competing aims and aspirations or priorities in Jewish education, right? One of the aims around that table is to generate members of a synagogue and participants, regular participants in worship. That is one potential outcome of Jewish education that takes place in a synagogue. And perhaps if those whose primary purpose is to have membership in the synagogue are making those determinations, it's not surprising that they might want to shape the curriculum in that direction. You mentioned the idea of Jewish education as a preventative measure. That's not a uniquely Jewish idea, actually. I think there are a lot of parents today who believe that somehow their education is going to construct and determine who their children will be. I don't think that putting kids in a particular situation educationally is going to be an immunization against all other influences in their lives, particularly when that education only happens a few hours a week. Is Jewish education a failure of execution, you asked, or implementation? Not necessarily. I think the challenge today is that we need to redefine what the aims of Jewish education are, and not simply accept that the historic aims are the aims that will fit the future of Judaism, of American Jews, of American life, and so on.
I'm dying to dive deeper into some of the threads that have come up about values for a bunch of reasons. There's discussion of Jewish values and a lot of the moves that people make when they don't want to teach Jewish education in a manner that Dan described, where it's just skills and it's just sort of rote things you do in synagogue. A lot of the pivots people make are towards Jewish values, and like literally entire curricula about, X, Y, or Z set of Jewish values. Without going totally down that line for a second, I want to reflect on something that came up earlier, because for me, I actually kind of sympathize and would place myself in a category that does want to teach like information. I wouldn't call it skills. I don't want to teach skills. I don't want people to like be learning how to do the various steps that are part of the Bar Mitzvah ceremony and then, do that and then what now? But I do err on the side of, for me, what is kind of a duality. It's not a pure duality, but between education and advocacy, I do err on the side of education. And I think that I actually reflect a lot on how when I was in BBYO, the youth group, B'nai B'rith Youth Organization, there was a position that I had, and it was called moreh, which means teacher, but it was the recruitment person. I never, I didn't know what it meant at the time, but when I learned what moreh meant, I was like, why are they calling the recruitment person in the chapter teacher? But it actually makes perfect sense to me, because the way that you get people to care about something, affiliate with something, connect to something is not by telling them, hey, you should care about this. It's by giving them information about that, and then, that information planting a seed that inspires them. So I've talked, about my love for Shavuot. I find that I have much more success getting people to connect to Shavuot when I give the background of the holiday, talk about its history, talk about how it's changed, than I do with you should love this. And so I want to reflect on that broadly in Jewish education, because I think we do a lot of teaching of emotions. We do a lot of teaching of love. And so the class, we've talked about this in the realm of Israel, for example. We don't have to necessarily focus there. When you talk to educators, I'm in Jewish Facebook groups, they will say that their goal is to have students at the end love Israel. And that's not my goal and not that I want the opposite, but my goal isn't for people to love something at the end of a lesson. It's for them to know something and then have the ability to meander their way through that something and come to some sort of practice or feeling. So my question is on that front of sort of teaching values, teaching love, teaching information. Like, how should we be looking at these issues? Or, I mean, maybe there's the question of like, how have descriptively different groups looked at this question as a historian, but also like, how would you sort of advocate, to use that word I just argued against, how would you advocate for us to approach this moving forward?
I think we can teach a love of learning. And I think that our goal today in Jewish education is to see the education not as an end in of itself, but as the beginning of a process that never ends. Learning should be a practice that Jews engage in. The same way that you train for marathons, or you learn to practice mindfulness or yoga, or even the practice of cooking without burning it or poisoning people.
Right.
Practices are what keep us alive, nourished, stimulated. We flourish when we have practices that allow us to contribute to the world, to make ourselves happy, to make other people happy. And those practices, when they come together, help us build communities. You can find any information that you want on the internet now. So it seems to me like our educational institutions really need to engage our learners in how to find information and discern and make decisions and decide what it has to do with them and where it belongs in their lives and how they might use it in the world, rather than just bringing in the information. I think there was a time when information wasn't so readily available that we thought about education as a linear process, where first you have to get the information, and only then can you figure out how to synthesize and apply it or do something creative with it. Bloom's taxonomy is the famous and classic and still relevant categorization. It's sort of a ladder of how we learn. First, you obtain knowledge, then you figure out what to do with it, and you move up this linear ladder. I think we're living in a world now that demands from us the ability to learn and do at the same time. And so that means that the curriculum of Jewish education has to pivot. See, the tension between skills and values, I think, is a false tension. It's forced by, frankly, lack of time. If you only have a few hours a week, what should we teach the kids? Well, look, my kids have learned a lot of skills by watching YouTube videos. There was the rainbow loom craze a few years ago where little kids taught themselves how to make all sorts of things out of tiny, colorful rubber bands by watching other kids do it on YouTube.
I know it well.
They learn how to unwrap presents on YouTube. They learn how to do all sorts of crazy stunts by watching people on YouTube. I'm not sure we should be spending hours in Hebrew school learning choreography when those videos are available. What we should be spending our hours doing is learning to live with one another, learning to do research. And when I say research, I don't mean the geeky kind of academic research that I do, although, send me your learners and I'd be happy to teach them. But I mean, awaken in young Jews a curiosity to find out more and to go home and start searching, and give them the tools of where to search, how to do it with their parents, looking over their shoulders. This does not have to be an independent journey. I actually think that the skills that we want to teach are skills of inquiry that can support a healthy curiosity and openness to the world that exists and the world that can be.
I think that this is a connected question. When it feels like one of the challenges for Jewish education is this question of, in a time where it's totally voluntary, even for a kid, because if a kid gives their parents a super hard time, the reality is that the parents are mostly going to eventually give up.
They'll cave in quickly.
Yeah, because the parents fundamentally also see it as a choice, and it's a choice that all things being equal, they'd rather their kid have some Jewish education. But if the kid really hates it and is really going to make a terrible time about it, then, that'll be a weight on the opposite side of the scale, and, let's just not. And so it feels like at every age it's a choice. So it feels to me like somehow that has to be part of it, that in a sense, the Jewish education has to be something that is calculated to inspire people to continue to choose it. I guess my question is also whether the education process is oriented toward a Judaism that is worthy of my choosing it, or the education process itself is the thing. And that's actually an area where I've been a little puzzled and a little bit trying to process the ideas of the people that are talking about flourishing being the center of Jewish education. Because I'm asking myself and I'm asking them, when you say that, do you mean that Judaism should lead to flourishing and the Jewish education is something that's oriented towards your taking more of an interest to Judaism, which will help you flourish in your life? Or is the Jewish education itself something that helps you flourish, and because you're flourishing in the education process, you're ultimately also coming closer to Judaism, whether or not Judaism actually helps you flourish?
I don't think of Judaism as a thing you choose. It's dynamic, it's changing, right? And sometimes those changes challenge us. They make us really uncomfortable, and we have to grow through them, and they help us grow. And sometimes it's really sweet and wonderful. My challenge with the literature on happiness and flourishing is that I think that a superficial understanding of that literature leaves people with a belief that Judaism is supposed to make me happy, or Judaism is supposed to make me feel good, and I just want the good parts. But real life is hard. And there's a whole movement in education now that is about the importance of kids learning to be resilient. And there's commentary now about how Gen Z is not prepared to deal in the real world, right? And there's such a struggle because their parents have been helicopter parents, or their parents have been steamroller parents or bulldozer parents. Parents today were all these vehicles that don't seem to be doing the right thing at the right time. So maybe the educational enterprise and what the Jewish educational enterprise has to offer is a way for parents to feel at home, for parents to have the resources to navigate through challenges, and to do so side by side with their children. If Jewish education is supposed to keep us in a system, it's going to work for some people and it's going to lose others. If Jewish education is about instilling curiosity and creativity and inquiry and give people lots of doors and windows to step into the tradition, make sense of it, figure out how to wrestle with it, that to me sounds like a more compelling way to think about how learning can help us be better humans, be better partners, be better participants in civilization.
I think of myself as a Jewish educator, and sometimes that surprises people because what we do, it's ambiguous and could fit in a lot of different fields. But when people ask, that's sort of the shorthand that I go to. And part of why I feel confident about doing that and why I feel it's important is because I want to push the boundaries of what people think of as Jewish education. I want people to think beyond a classroom setting. Not, by the way, I do spend time in some classroom settings, and I enjoy those experiences, and I spent 2 years wandering around to a lot of Sunday schools, specifically working with those settings. But I want us to think more broadly, both because I think descriptively it's just the case that education happens in a lot of places that aren't classrooms, whether that's places that are maybe a little intuitive, like a synagogue, but not in the classroom. So in a sanctuary, whether it's, a JCC, whether it's, et cetera, or even just a grocery store in a conversation with someone, or Facebook in a conversation with someone. But I wanted to pose to you, how should we think of the terrain of where we're even talking about? How should we push ourselves maybe to think about Jewish education in ways that aren't just teacher in room of students in classroom environment?
Our community tends to think about innovation education as moving to a different setting. So Jewish camp was a big progressive innovation of the 20th century because going outside, building community, having these immersive environments where you could really instill values and strengthen a movement and prepare leaders for the next generation, that's what the American Jewish camping movement was all about. Today, their tagline is belonging, feeling a sense of belonging to the community, which is not necessarily an educational outcome, it's a communal outcome. I think we need to stop thinking about educational change as creating new spaces, moving to new settings, or creating new models. It has to be a whole new way of thinking. And we have to allow education to continue to evolve as society is evolving. Much has been said about our currently living in a knowledge society or an information society. When the Jewish educational system as we know it was created, we lived in an industrial society. Education was designed to feed laborers into that society and to bring order to a society that was experiencing rapid change. Well, we're experiencing rapid change again. And we often look to Jewish education or education in general as a tool for trying to manipulate or engineer what society can be and what it can become. So if today we live in a knowledge society or an information society, if you will, what do we do with that information? What does that actually mean to us? Because we're actually inundated with information, and we don't always know if the information we're getting is accurate or what's the agenda behind the information. If you Google Shabbat, for example, ask Rav Siri, ask Rav Alexa, what is Shabbat? The answers that you get will be determined by the algorithm, will be determined by search engine optimization. And the Chabad answer, the Reform.org answer, there's so many different answers that you'll get. What is today's learner going to do with that? What does getting the information lead to next? There's a growing movement in the education world around using education as a tool to shift from a knowledge society to a creative society. So that poses a really interesting question to us as a Jewish community when we think about our aspirations in Jewish education, because we are in the habit of thinking about Jewish educational aspirations in terms of continuity, belonging, connection. You mentioned love of subject matter or choosing or buying in. That's one way of thinking about it. We also think about Jewish education as a tool for membership, perpetuating certain institutions, beliefs, skills, and so on. But what if Jewish education could be the laboratory for imagining the future that we do not yet know? Like the art studio that is both expressive, but also a space to integrate and synthesize ideas and play with ideas. Now, you could argue that that takes a certain degree of sophistication and you need to build up a certain knowledge base before you can do that. But watch any kindergartner play and you will see all sorts of sophisticated ideas and imagination bubbling up. Just doesn't sound the way we articulate it as adults. Every morning, my daughter, who is 5, wakes me up at approximately 5:45 a.m. to say, "Mommy, can I play?" I kind of wish she wouldn't wake me up, but then I'm always happy that she did. Why? Because I hear her playing in this little high voice, inventing characters out of her little figurines. She's creating a world every morning at 5:45 a.m. when I don't even want to be conscious. Imagine if we could take that kindergarten mentality and all of the potential that's inside it, and then continue to fuel that throughout the various life stages. It doesn't have to always happen in formal environments. And I want to say as an important caveat, when we move it to informal environments, we don't need to take the formality with it. right? So I think one mistake we make is that we go to camp and then we have this part of camp that's called learning, where we sit and actually have a formal learning exercise under a tree that has not actually dramatically shifted what the learning looks like. There just may be a breeze, or we may be a little sweaty, and there are more bugs to distract us.
One thing, Lex very comfortably describes himself as a Jewish educator, whereas I tend not to. And yet it's been interesting to me to realize over the past few months the extent to which I think our podcast is fairly understood to be education. And what I've realized is that what I feel like is not an educator, but a public student. And what seems to be the case is that being a public student is actually the kind of educator that many people need. And I've seen my friend B'nai Lappi do that extremely effectively, where she teaches Talmud, but it doesn't feel like a didactic way that she's teaching. It feels like and it's true that she's often just as much learning along with the class and being amazed at the insights of the other people in the class that she's, quote, teaching. And so on the one hand, she very much is the teacher, but on the other hand, she really is a student in the class with more knowledge than maybe everybody else. And I guess I'm wondering, though, so what does it look like in practical terms, in terms of things maybe that are already happening, but also, in things that may not already be happening? Like, how do you imagine, for example, camp being different, or how do you imagine other contexts being able to be this new kind of education?
I love the term that you shared of being a public student. There are a lot of people who fancy themselves public intellectuals, and usually that means that they share ideas and people imbibe them and think about them. Jewish education should be thought-provoking. It should be a conversation, and that is, in fact, what this podcast is engaging people in. So it makes a lot of sense. Just getting people to think outside of themselves and to question assumptions and look at things from different perspectives. I think one of the essential elements of the aspiration of a creative society is that we are engaged in a process of thinking in new ways. That means that we learn how to look at assumptions and then look at them from another angle or from another perspective, and then compare and contrast those perspectives. It doesn't simply mean questioning and critiquing everything. I've seen kids walk into Hebrew school and say, well, I believe that I've been told that Judaism is about questioning, and so I'm just going to question everything, which is a really fun game to play with the teacher when you're a kid. So I don't mean just questioning in sort of a superficial or snarky sense, but I mean actually growing the muscle of empathy that enables humans to look at issues and life experiences from multiple angles and perspectives, and then analyze those carefully and deeply. Our conventional models of pedagogy don't make a lot of space for that kind of self-exploration and growth of self-awareness. So I think that if Jewish education can focus on those social emotional tools, our learners will be more prepared to walk into a gap year program, a college classroom, seek out adult education opportunities, choose the forms of engagement where they get to do really interesting do-it-yourself learning. Those are the kinds of habits that we want to instill. So I would think about the curriculum more in terms of the habits of mind that empower humans to think and act creatively than the habits of mind that simply allow them to replicate things.
We've covered a lot of really fantastic ground. Is there anything that we haven't touched on yet that you think is important for us to engage with, both us as, public students and our listeners?
There are certain myths about creativity that prevent people from understanding why it's a good idea or why it's not simply a buzzword. People tend to think of creativity as being about the arts or being the realm of lone geniuses like the Van Goghs and the Mozarts of history. But the idea of building a creative society and a creative community is about people with different talents feeling empowered to contribute their best selves to a process of adaptation and disruption. Creativity isn't simply a matter of the future and something we might change in the future. But in fact, I would argue that Jews have been flexing their creative muscles throughout Jewish history. And in fact, that has been one of our survival instincts. Jews, both famous leaders and lesser known individuals who are simply saving their families and making life work, had to come up with creative solutions to the problems of their day. And I'd like us to think about our Jewish educational enterprise as the laboratory for our kids learning that their inheritance is not simply tablets that are cold and etched in stone and handed from one generation to the next. But it's actually ways of thinking and wisdom and ways of being in the world that will help them figure out what the future should look like. I don't want our kids to feel helpless. I want them to feel empowered to come up with creative solutions to the problems of their day.
Thank you so much, Miriam Heller-Stern, for joining us. And thank you for kicking off this Jewish Education Unit in a fantastic way with a fantastic conversation.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks so much, of course, to all of you out there listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. Specifically, right now, we hope that you'll tune in the near future, next week, the next week after that, a whole bunch of weeks where we are looking at Jewish education in a deep way. We've got a bumpin' set of episodes coming your way over the next many weeks. So come along for the ride. It'll be a good one. Before we close, we also want to remind you that on our website right now and in your email inboxes, if you have signed up, we've got our Elul Unbound initiative going. So head to JudaismUnbound.com, click on our various Elul tabs, sign up for our daily email if you are interested. It's not too late. And enjoy this Challah month that we're experiencing as an on-ramp to Rosh Hashanah, to Yom Kippur, to our high holidays in not too long. With that, we are going to close out this episode, and to do so, we're going to tell you all the different ways you can be in touch with us. The first is that you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can head to our Twitter feed at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can hit us up via email at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we like to make is that you can always support us financially with either a one-time donation or a monthly recurring gift. And you can do either of those at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.